Well, welcome back to our next lesson in our Finding Hope in Jesus Bible study. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at key truth number 4. There was no death in the world God created. Death is the result of sin. Well, after God placed Adam in the garden, he told him in verse 16, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat." So God told Adam here in verse number 16 that he may freely eat of every tree in the garden. God provided everything for man to live on. He told Adam that he could eat whenever he wanted, he could eat how much he wanted. But then in verse number 17, we read this, "But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." So what's the first word in verse 17? It's the word but, right? God told Adam that he could eat from every tree but one tree. And what was the name of that tree? It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What does knowledge mean? Well, in this case, it means more than just to know something. It means to know something by experience. Shortly after commanding Adam, God created the first woman. Her name was Eve. Now, up to this point, Adam and Eve only experienced the good. They had not experienced evil because there was no evil in the world God created. So, what did God say back in verse number 17 would happen if they ate the fruit of that tree? Well, he says here that they would, at the end of verse 17, surely die. Now, is this something that might happen? Or, might they die? Or would it happen? Well, no. The word surely here, it means that it absolutely will happen. You see, death is something new that would be introduced into God's creation if they were to disobey God. Death was not a part of God's creation. And this death that God is speaking about is something much worse than physical death. The word death itself means separation. And there's 3 aspects to this death or separation. If they were to disobey God, first of all, they would be separated from God in their relationship to Him. Secondly, this separation from God would lead to physical death. Adam and Eve's life came from God, so being separated from the source of life would lead to physical death in the future. And thirdly, if a man dies being separated from the source of life, if he dies being separated from God, he will be separated from God for all eternity in hell. Now, God did not create death, but death, like sin, came into our world as a result of man's sin and disobedience to God. And the good news is that although man is born into this world spiritually separated from God, God provided a way for man to come into a right relationship with Him. Now, some people wonder why God placed a tree in the garden and then forbid Adam to eat from it. Well, it's because God made Adam and Eve with a free will. God wanted Adam and Eve to obey Him. But God also gave them the freedom to choose to obey or disobey. And it's the same with us today. We can choose to obey God and experience the good, or we can choose to disobey and bring suffering and hardship into our life. It's our choice. Now, some people may ask the question, well, wouldn't the world be a better place if God had not given us a free will? The Bible tells us that God created us for His glory, for His pleasure. Now think for a moment from a parent's perspective. I am a parent. I have 4 children. As a parent, do I force my children to love me? Do parents in general force their children to love them? Do they program their children like a robot to love their parents back? Would the parent even get any pleasure from a love from a child like that? Well, not when you consider that that child would not have a choice in giving that love back, since it's an involuntary act. It's a programmed action. Friends, there are many joys of being a parent. And one of them is when one of my children will just come up to me and just give me a big hug and say, "I love you, Dad." Oh, that gives me so much joy and pleasure as their dad. God purposely created man with the free will. So imagine the joy and pleasure God receives when one of his children willingly and voluntarily demonstrates true love back to him.